In this video, we'll be looking at reproduction in vertebrates. It is found in paper 1 and it's a very short chapter of only 6 marks, but still do not neglect this. So the basics of this is to look at the reproductive strategies that animals have in order to have the most reproductive success when it comes to their offspring. And we're going to look at the following points that they have provided in the exam guidelines. We're going to look at the difference between external and internal fertilization. We're going to look at ovipori, ovovivipori, and then vivapori. We're going to look at the amniotic egg, precocial and altricial development, and then parental care. So external and internal fertilization. External fertilization is when fertilization takes place outside the female's body, and this is generally found in fish and in amphibians. So if we look at this diagram on the right hand side, yes, the male is clasping the female, but there is no penetration or copulation that occurs. The female releases her eggs, and as she does that, the male releases his sperm cells above the eggs in order for them to then be fertilized. And with this, water is necessary to help the sperm as a mode of transport to get to the eggs, and then also to prevent the eggs from drying out because they don't have a hard outer shell layer that protects them. Now, in this case, there are many offspring produced. As you can see, these eggs will give rise to quite a few tadpoles, and that's also many gametes are produced. So the egg cells, that's a gamete, and the sperm cell is also a gamete. So many gametes are produced. Because these eggs are now exposed to the environmental conditions, including predators, very few of these will survive, so many have to be produced. Now the gametes, so the egg and the sperm, are released into the water where fertilization occurs. The water prevents gametes from drying out, as I mentioned above. Now the eggs release chemicals to attract the sperm, because in this case there is no reproductive system which in a certain sense guides the sperm cells to where they need to be. And this is an open water system, so the eggs need to release these chemicals in order for the sperm to be able to find them. Looking at the fish here on the right hand side, so females will release their egg cells, and then the males won't be far off, and then releasing their sperm cells right above where the egg cells are. And then there's a zoomed in section here showing the sperm cells on top of the egg cells, hopefully going to fertilize them. Now, predators play a big role in reducing the amount of offspring that survive in external fertilization, because like I said, these eggs are now exposed to the elements, and that includes predators that want to eat them. And then there's little cooperative behavior. So even though the male frog is clasping the female frog, there's no real cooperative behavior in the sense that mating has to occur with copulation, because if this female is wiggling around, there's going to be no penetration, which means that fertilization won't occur. So looking at these chickens down here, there has to be cooperation in order for fertilization to occur here, because if she's going to move around, it's not going to work. Which brings me to internal fertilization. So this takes place inside the female's body, and this is generally found in terrestrial vertebrates. So terrestrial means land, and then aquatic means water, just so you know the difference there. Now in this case, I haven't added it here, but the offspring are generally dependent in most of the cases. Well, you get independent offspring and then dependent offspring, so you can get both here, but majority of the cases the offspring are dependent of the parents. Fewer gametes are produced in this case, and fewer offspring will also be produced because there is some sort of parental care involved, with the parents making sure that the offspring get food and that they actually survive and protect them against predators. And with this type of fertilization, it is not limited to an aquatic environment, as water is not needed to help prevent the the eggs drying out, because some of it will be internally with a placenta, others will be eggs that will be laid with a hard outer shell, and then the sperm in this case are released directly into the female's body, as we mentioned here at the top. The developing embryo remains inside the female, so that's also protection where these ones are exposed. And then with this one, like I said, a lot of cooperative behavior is necessary in order for copulation to be successful. This now brings us to the different ways in which the eggs develop in a sense. So ovipary, so this is when an embryo develops in an egg outside the female's body, and examples of these are fish, amphibians, some reptiles and birds. So aquatic eggs, like we mentioned with the frogs, have a protective jelly layer, and the eggs have less yolk, so there's less energy used to produce. Looking at these eggs here, you can see, if you've ever played with frog eggs, some of you might have when you were little, they're very slimy and jelly-like, and that is in order to protect them to a certain extent. And then also they have less yolk, so the yolk is important because that is a source of nutrition for the developing embryo. Terrestrial eggs have a hard outer shell, as we can see in these examples, and they will have lots of yolk. So a lot of energy is required to produce these kinds of eggs, and less energy is used to produce the aquatic eggs, because there's also so many of them produced at once, and then it also requires less energy because of less yolk. Ovovivipary, now this is quite an interesting one. So this you'll get in some sharks, lizards and snakes, and in this case the embryo is surrounded by a thin membranous shell inside the female's body, so the eggs remain inside the female's body. The developing embryo will receive nutrition from this egg because of the yolk that is in it, and then the egg is laid as soon as the embryo is fully developed and ready to hatch. So these eggs will develop, these embryos will develop inside the egg and not inside the placenta like we have within mammals. And then shortly afterwards, the newborn breaks through the soft membrane, hence the term ovovivipary. So this section has to do with development in the egg, and then vivipary has to do with live birth. That's why they say, hence the term ovovivipary. Then the eggs develop inside the female's body, which means that they are protected from predators. Okay, so the predators can't reach them unless they kill the parent. Then vivipary, which we fall into this class. So internal fertilization takes place here. Then the fertilized egg develops into an embryo without the protection of the shell, because we have something called the placenta that will provide nutrition. We've got the amniotic cavity with the amnion, that's a protective membrane around, so we don't really need an egg. Now the embryo or fetus is directly connected to the mother as it receives nutrients through the placenta, which consists of embryonic and maternal tissues. You'll learn about this with human reproduction. And then the female produces fewer gametes, so requiring less energy. For example, in humans there's only one egg cell produced. With the male humans there's plenty of sperm cell produced, but with the females there's only one egg cell produced. And then parental care, so the feeding and protection of the developing embryo and fetus is there. However, it requires large quantities of energy, because now you have to feed the offspring either with milk or providing it with food that has been hunted or collected, and then just taking care of a little young thing running around is quite a lot of energy. Now, I threw this one in here just for interest's sake. Did you know that scorpions give birth to live young as well? And then they take care of them by giving them piggyback rides like this until they are mature enough and they've got a nice hard outer shell. Lions also give birth to live young, and they also have a lot of parental care. Elephants as well. Next, we'll look at the amniotic egg, which you should be able to label, and it's not that hard to draw it as well. It looks complicated, but as soon as you start, you'll see it's not that hard. So water protects the aquatic vertebrates' eggs from drying out and assists with fertilization. Whereas some terrestrial animals need a specialized structure to protect the developing embryo from drying out, and these embryos are then enclosed in an egg with a hard shell, which brings us to the amniotic egg. Now, the function of the amniotic egg is to prevent dehydration of the embryo. It provides nutrients in the form of water and oxygen, and it also ensures that waste products are removed. So this is the amniotic egg, and you can find this diagram in the answer series grade 12 Life Sciences part 1, and you'll see that a lot of these labels are labels that you'll also find in a diagram representing the development of a human embryo and all of the structures involved there. So let's get going. So the chorion is this membrane you see around here, and what the chorion does, it is the outermost membrane. So in birds and reptiles, it has a porous shell for gaseous exchange, and then in mammals, it forms part of the placenta. So this is now specifically with the human embryo as well. It supplies the fetus with nutrients and also helps with gaseous exchange and excretion. Then you've got the developing embryo that sits in here. You've got the amniotic cavity, which is this light gray area going around the embryo with the amniotic fluid. So the amniotic fluid is all of this gray area over here. And what this does is it surrounds the embryo and it protects it against shocks, injuries, temperature changes, and dehydration. So very similar to what the amniotic cavity and fluid does for human embryo development. Then you've got the amnion, which is that membrane. Okay, then moving on to the albumin, which is this area over here. And the albumin, if you crack a chicken egg, that is the white portion, is the albumin. And it serves as a reserve food source with regards to proteins and water as well. Then the allantois, this membrane over here that you see, so it extends from the developing embryo outwards, and what this does is it is a sac that extends from the embryo's intestines, and it collects waste products, and it helps with gaseous exchange. Then you've got the shell, which is the hard outer shell here, and it is hard, calcareous, and leathery, and porous for gaseous exchange, and then most importantly, it protects the embryo. And then lastly, you've got the yolk sac that sits over there, and the yolk sac is energy-rich yolk that provides food for the embryo. And as this embryo develops, you'll see that this yolk sac starts to get smaller and smaller as all of these nutrients are then used. Next, we're going to look at precocial and altricial development. So precocial is when the offspring are fully developed and they can move around directly after birth. An example of this is birds, and then certain mammals will also do this. And we say that they can basically defend themselves against predators. They can find food to a certain extent. So in this case, few offspring are produced, as lots of energy is required in getting them to this advanced stage of development before birth. So less energy is used in the care of the offspring after birth because they don't have to be babied as much. They can walk around on their own, and they don't have to be carried around like lions will do with their cubs in their mouths when they need to move them. Then the eggs will contain a large amount of yolk for an extended incubation period, specifically in birds as well. Mammals will have a longer gestation period, so gestation is the time that the offspring is carried within the mother developing, and then they will also be covered with hair or feathers when they are born. And the offspring can attempt to protect themselves, and they can feed themselves to a certain extent. So you'll see that, so this is a young wildebeest. It will eat grass at some point, so it can feed itself, but it will also still need milk from the mother. And wildebeest, for example, need to have young that are precocial, that are ready to run and go, because wildebeest partake in migrations, not as much in South Africa, but if you go to Kenya, Tanzania, they migrate in those areas. So sometimes these little ones are born on the migration route, which means they need to be getting up very quickly to be able to keep up with the rest of the herd. Altricial, so the offspring are not fully developed and cannot move around immediately after being born. Humans are an example of that, and then certain birds as well, your kittens at home or your little puppies, and then kangaroos also give birth to altricial young. In fact, baby kangaroos look quite ugly when they are born, and then they crawl into the mother's pouch after being born, and then from there they'll develop. I think it takes around 9 months before they actually then leave the pouch. So in this case, more offspring are produced because there's little energy required with developing them, because they are not fully developed yet. So more energy is then spent on care of the offspring after birth, because now these little ones need to be fed and protected. So you can see that they can't even see yet. These little kittens' eyes aren't even open yet, and in the case of the kangaroos here, or baby joeys as well. So the eggs have smaller than precocial eggs, and they contain less yolk because they in there for a lot, well, less time than the precocial ones. Mammals, the young are born as soon as possible, as mothers are vulnerable to predation, so that the little ones can be hidden away. In most cases, they won't have any hair or feathers. In kittens, you'll see that, but in the case of the kangaroos, there's no hair. The offspring can definitely not protect themselves in the state that they are, and the offspring can also not feed themselves, so they are reliant on the mothers in this case. Moving on to parental care, so it's the behavior of parents in caring for their offspring. And examples here include guarding of the eggs, incubation of the eggs, keeping the young warm, feeding the young, and protection from predators. So there's fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, which we'll look at here. In fish, there's no parental care, so the eggs are abandoned after fertilization. So as soon as those gametes have been released, those fish will move out of there. Amphibians, there's little parental care, but there is still a little parental care in the form of them guarding the eggs and protecting the eggs from predators. In certain cases, even after the eggs have hatched, the little tadpoles, if there's no water around, the parents will give them a little piggyback ride to close water. Reptiles, there's also little parental care here. Basically, crocodiles will also guard their eggs ferociously sometimes. It's quite dangerous getting close to a crocodile nest, as we can see down here. And then heat of the sun generally incubates the eggs with certain snakes. Crocodiles will bury their eggs. Then in birds, there's a lot of parental care. So there's the building of nests. The eggs can be incubated and protected in this case. But there's also precocial and altricial development. So there's various levels of parental care. So for example, these chicks up here will require less parental care than these ones on the top right hand side. Mammals, we have the highest degree of parental care by protecting the young from predators, feeding the young. The parents will teach the young how to find food. So we've got some meerkats down here, lions grooming the little ones, feeding them, bringing them food, teaching them how to hunt eventually. Wild dogs are quite interesting, so the adults will go out and they'll hunt, and then they'll chomp down on the food, and then they'll come back to the den and they'll regurgitate the food for the puppies, and then they'll chew on that. They're quite smelly animals, but I love them. They're really, really interesting and also very endangered. And that is the end of this video.